be against us. But does every problem have to be solved by the loudest voices or the biggest armies? Tonight, world's sporting authorities are in turmoil. Football and boxing have thrown Russian athletes out of international competition. Now the iconic Wimbledon tournament has gone a step further. The players, past and present, are furious. Martina Navratilova, herself a refugee from Russian domination, protests that players shouldn't be held responsible for their government's actions and punished for being born in the wrong place. Inevitably, the French have taken a different stance to the Brits, allowing Russians like world number 2 Daniil Medvedev and Arina Sabalenka to compete as long as they don't wave the Russian flag. Many say that sport shouldn't be put at the service of politics. But the supporters of the ban argue that's exactly what always happens anyway, and that the famously sports-mad Russian president would be hurt more by a Wimbledon ban than any number of UN resolutions. And they point out that sporting bans were crucial to the defeat of apartheid. So our choice, should the Russians be banned from Wimbledon, or is there a better way to stop Putin? In the next 60 minutes, two passionate believers come head-to-head in the search for common ground. And coming up later on the show, we'll hear from Ukraine's top female tennis player, Elena Svitolina, who has been as high as third in the world rankings, on what she thinks should happen. But with me tonight in the studio, Dr. Mike Duignan, Director of the Observatory for Human Rights and Events at the University of Surrey, and Editor-in-Chief of Event Management, the Journal for the Study of Events and Festivals, and Dr. Rachel Pistol, Historian and Research Fellow at King's College London. Let's begin, if we can, by preparing the ground and find out a bit more about our two guests and what they believe. If I can start with you, Mike. What is the case for the ban imposed by the All England Club?
So the idea with the ban is that by exerting some form of economic and social pressure on Russia, on Putin's regime, then the idea is that piece by piece, if every event does these kinds of specific actions, then we can exert enough pressure to reduce the likelihood that Putin will continue in that regime. Yeah.
Now, I know you'll, as we'll discuss it, you'll say that this is nuanced and so on, but you've definitely taken a position. Why does this matter at all to you personally?
I think it's about understanding the broader uses of events, really, and we've spent a decade working with events, festivals of all shapes and sizes, to look at how they can do social good. And there's a lot of different ways in which they can be leveraged to exert pressure on regimes whereby there is human rights abuses, violations, and events and festivals are a great platform for doing that, as we've seen with various other major events in the past. But they also serve as a bat signal to say when social change is needed. And I think that it's really on the event owners and organisers to understand the power and potential of their event for shaping public discourse. They are important tools for doing that.
Rachel, why do you oppose this ban?
Well, I come at this very much from a perspective of being a historian who's looked at what happens in terms of refugees, immigration, xenophobia, and what happens to foreigners living in other countries during times of war. And so really, whilst I completely appreciate where Mike's coming from, I'm looking at how this affects individuals who actually might have taken a stance against Russia in this instance, or against whatever the warring nation is, and actually how this affects them, and saying, whilst I completely support the idea of banning anything that relates to sort of team sports, or anything that really is key in terms of boosting Russia's international image, I take a very different stance when it comes to what happens with individuals. Unless they're actively using their position to actually promote the war, how much effect is this really going to have in trying to stop Putin?
Why does it matter to you? I mean, this is basically some people banging balls across a net. Is it really that important to you personally?
It all comes down to discrimination and how you're discriminating against people. And if you look at the history in the 20th and the 21st century and how people have been dehumanised by having labels applied to them, whether that be their nationality, whether it be the colour of their skin, whether it be their religion, I think it's just we have to be very careful. It's a very fine line that you walk down before this turns into something much more sinister.
OK, well, we've already established one piece of common ground, I think. Let me check this with you. That this is actually just a lot more important than what a few talented millionaires who are good with a racket do. For you, Mike, it's actually about how we effect social or political, in this case, geopolitical change. For you, it's how we resist discrimination, or how we identify and how we resist discrimination. Is that the first point, that we agree that this is something much more important than just a game of tennis?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to understand which side to fall on. It depends. If you empathise with the individual, and it's really hard to not be compassionate about the individual plight. But the point in which maybe we depart or differ is that I think that there is a broader problem, there's a broader emergency, and emergencies require emergency responses. And emergency responses are uncomfortable. And it's very difficult to know really what is the right responses, particularly when we're in the fog of war, literally right now. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's. I mean, even as Andy Murray said, he said there's not necessarily a right decision because, of course, there are arguments on both sides. So it's how you apply this and actually what makes this situation so different from, say, other humanitarian crises that perhaps aren't being supported in similar ways. I think that's one issue. I mean, even down into the details, such as the fact that at the moment it's only the players who are banned. So if you're a Russian or a Belarusian physiotherapist or umpire or somebody like that, then you can actually technically still possibly attend.
OK, well, let's come down into the detail. And if I may say so, you're both being stupendously reasonable thus far. But let's get down into the detail and see if this atmosphere of love and harmony survives. Let's first talk to you about your case, Mike. The players who are going to be banned aren't on this occasion representing their nations. Why punish them? It's got nothing to do with them.
it hasn't got anything to do with them, but I think for me, it confuses two things. I think the first thing is that it's not about the individuals at all. And that's why I have a challenge thinking about that this is a xenophobic particular issue. I think that because the issue is much more broader, I think that we have to transcend, in this case, national identity and think, well, what is the thing that we should be doing to alleviate the wider problem? So I don't think it is an issue with the individual. For example, I saw Rachel's article about cats being taken away from a feline competition, which I think is a really important point. And if it was not this case, if it wasn't war on European soil, then I would agree. But I think that getting rid of cats in feline competitions is an important issue, but I think that there are bigger fish to fry in this sense, and I think that there's some people, unfortunately, that have to be part of the collateral damage of this, though we don't want anyone to be.
Before we go further, but you might like to explain to viewers, Rachel, the entire cat question, because there's some confusion here between cats and fish and all that. So just explain to us what's going on.
I think it's really it's interesting that you picked up on that one piece of the article. But yes, I mean, the entire article looked at actually how Russophobic events had actually been taking place in the West, in Britain and in America, where actually people who had Russian names or Russian-sounding names were being targeted because people felt that they wanted to do something in order to help the Ukrainian war effort, and it's this idea that you really need to do some action, make some action. So you ban you ban Russian breeds from cat competitions, and you ban Russian music from concerts. But what I argue is that actually, how much is that really helping Ukrainians? Is that more of a tokenistic effort to make you feel better, rather than actually doing something positive that might help the victims of this
Isn't that
war?
a problem, Mike, that actually you might say this is not really about individuals, but it's about their national identity? But in truth, the action that takes place is against and about individuals rather than nation to nation.
It is. And it's unfortunate that individuals are caught up in this maelstrom. That's where we definitely agree. The question is, and in that article, there are some really deep points, which is that, there are people that have been xenophobic towards Russian people, that people have been looting Russian firms, and without a doubt, people get caught in that. And Rachel mentions that that's the people who have, perhaps full of some form of hatred, will take it out. But they will take it out on them and various other people who they don't like in various other cases. And I think that is them doing something, but they do not represent.
Yeah, but let's just dwell with this question about whether you can separate the individual from their national identity. Let's take, for example, someone who, in this country, had voted to remain in 2016. The vote went the other way. Mm. That doesn't mean that they can now, when they're on they're in an Italian or a French airport and they're entering that space, they can say, "Oh, look, don't blame me. I want to go in the EU queue because that's where I wanted to stay." If you are British, that's your decision. Mm. It's not. You can't claim it's got nothing to do with me, unless, of course, you renounce your nationality.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that individuals get caught up in the maelstrom of it all. People are individual; they are Russian nationals, obviously. But fundamentally, my view and my point of this is that we have to transcend the individual to think on a more collective and bigger level. And unfortunately, there has to be, in these cases, some sort of casualty to put more pressure. Because I think that although individually it looks fairly significant, just banning a player or two, collectively, piece by piece and cumulatively, it adds weight on weight on weight on weight. And I think that we have to do it. And I think we need to just constantly see that bigger picture. Although, clearly, lots of things are xenophobic.
Well, I mean, and that's just it, because civilians are always the collateral damage, and you are always tarred with the brush of whatever is going on with your government, regardless of whether you support it, as you mentioned with Brexit. It's exactly the same. I mean, at the outbreak of war, you had the MP for North Thanet in Kent, Roger Gale, saying we should send all Russians home, even though there'd be some good and honest people who would naturally get caught up in the collateral damage. And yeah, on the flip side of that, you have to think that actually many of the people who live in the West, who are Russians, live here for a reason. And that is because they don't support their government, or they have dissented in some way that makes it unsafe for them to return to their home country. Indeed,
some of these Russian tennis players specifically do not live in Russia. I mean, they may live in Monaco for tax reasons, but they don't live in Russia.
No, they don't. They don't. And I think that for me, it's just going back to the point about the xenophobia. I went onto the Cambridge English Dictionary and had a look at just what the definition was, and it was an extreme dislike or fear of foreigners, their customs, their religions. And, going back to the central question of whether Wimbledon should ban, they aren't banning on xenophobic grounds, fundamentally. They're banning based on a much broader political and economic pressure grounds. And I think that it's really important to come back to that point.
Can I just ask you one last practical question? Will Putin care? I mean, actually, is there a danger that banning Russian players might actually play into his narrative, that he now goes on telly in Moscow and says to Russians, "You see, I told you they hate us. I told you the West really just wants to persecute us. And now our brilliant Russian players are being excluded, not for anything they've done, but because people do not like Russians." Exactly Rachel's point.
Yeah, I agree. It will play. There's obviously a polar opinion. There's the view in the media that in Russia, Putin has a lot of support, but yet when you look on the ground, you see a lot of political resentment and dissent. So, depending on your position, depending on your group, you're going to see it in completely different ways. It's going to play into the hands of ones and then not play into the hands of the others. So, how are you going to resolve that challenge?
Putin can use this, however it's played out, he will be able to use it for some sort of political capital anyway. But I think it's also really important to remember that we are looking at a difference between, obviously you've already had all of your, Russian and Belarusian team sports. They've already been banned from competing and everything. And we're not talking about the Davis Cup here, where people are representing their country. We're talking about individuals who actually, on the rest of the tennis circuit, they're actually able to not have their flag or nationality put up. So they're essentially playing as neutrals. And I think it's a very different situation when you've got people who are actively using their position and fame to support Putin. So if you take all the cases in the Olympics, which of course you'll be very familiar with, that's very different, but I'm sure you're going to come to that.
Yeah, we will. Well, look, I think there's quite a lot of agreement here between two of you that we need to be reasonable. But interestingly, you're both being incredibly reasonable about the fact that you won't agree about what to do. I'll be testing the ground a bit further with Rachel's view in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Dr. Mike Duignan, Director of the Observatory for Human Rights and Events at the University of Surrey, and Dr. Rachel Pistol, historian and research fellow at King's College London. We're talking about whether Russian players should be banned from Wimbledon. Rachel, it cannot be right to force Ukrainian players to share a court with people who haven't condemned the invasion of their country, surely?
Well, that is the real issue, isn't it, in terms of whether in the draw you get Russians and Ukrainians drawn against each other, particularly if they haven't. If you look at many of the big name players who are being banned, they have actually said that they want to promote peace. They're not interested in war.
Yeah, but that's not the same thing as saying, Mr. Putin, get your tanks out of Luhansk or...
And I think we have to remember that Russia is not a democracy. There are very harsh penalties against anybody who expresses dissent. So in terms of these individuals, we have to think about what sorts of reprisals might be made on their families as well, which is the most likely explanation of what's holding them back from actually publicly saying. If you look at the recent law Putin put in that's jailing people for up to 15 years for spreading what is called false information about the war, which is essentially telling anybody what is actually happening, the penalties are high. So there is always that threat of coercion as well, which is possibly hindering people. Plus the idea of, you've got your nationality because of where you were born. You obviously had no say in where you were born. And to renounce your nationality is actually a very big thing. And you run the risk of becoming stateless. With tennis players, very unlikely. I'm sure you'll be able to actually seek asylum somewhere else. But it's actually a very big process. So this will be holding a lot of them back from making bolder statements.
Isn't that right, Mike? That actually the Wimbledon ban, to be precise, is that players are not allowed to play unless they make a statement repudiating the invasion. But as Rachel just pointed out, that's not just a few words on paper issued by your PR agency. That is putting your mum in some serious danger.
Yeah, it's substantive, isn't it? It's incredibly substantive, and I think that put ourselves in the position of the players. Would we do it for what Nadal says are points on a tournament ranking? I don't. I think when pitted against each other, I don't think I would. So I suspect that we have to be very, very careful about what we think tennis players should do, sports people should do, should sign, should give away their nationality, should put their family in harm. I think it's a case of what do we prioritise when the chips are down? What do we prioritise?
Yeah, but there is a real-world thing here, though, Rachel, isn't there? We don't know that these families will be put at harm. And to be honest, if anybody can protect their families, it's going to be a multi-millionaire tennis player who lives in Monaco or Switzerland and basically spends very little time in Russia, and who could, frankly, if he or she wanted, get them out.
But you need to be able to get them out. And at the moment, that is not a straightforward issue, is it? I mean, even if we think about the Olympics and when you look at the Belarusian athletes who defected, then actually her husband had to then drive across to Poland. The borders are not open now. So you don't have that ability to just say, actually, I'm going to make this statement, you need to get out of the country now. It's not possible.
But let's talk about the point that Mike made. For the sporting authorities, there has to be a decision made. They can't simply say, well, nothing to do with us. Otherwise, isn't there a danger that Wimbledon or whoever else looks like they're simply complicit in saying we don't like the invasion, but not doing anything about it, which, of course, is what the authorities who run the French Open, who said, we're not going to do this ban thing. That's what, to some people, they look like. They look like they're ready to talk, but actually, in the end, they don't mind throwing the Ukrainians to the dogs.
The ITF have been very clear in their
The
stance.
International Tennis Federation.
Yes, and they've said that actually, so long as people are competing as individuals and they're not supporting the war and they are not representing their country, then they see no reason why they cannot compete as individuals.
But in truth, they're not competing as individuals. They will be, as we've seen before, Mr. Putin, anytime anybody Russian wins anything anywhere, whether it's judo or tiddlywinks or something, he's on Russian television proclaiming that Russia is mighty and world-beating.
But this isn't actually the first time that individuals have been treated differently from their country. So, for example, during apartheid in South Africa, there were sanctions against the South African teams. They couldn't compete in the Davis Cup, etc., but the individual players could actually compete. And you even had Arthur Ashe, who was a Black American tennis champion who wasn't able to compete in South Africa, but he was very much for putting sanctions on the country and stopping them from doing things. But when it came to the individual players, he was very much against people doing tokenistic acts like forfeiting a match against an individual South African player because he fought for the rights of the individual.
Mike?
Interesting. Yeah, I think on your point about soft power, you know, the idea that events are used for political and economic gain as well as pressure. I thought that it was quite interesting in an article that I wrote that it's quite interesting and ironic that these events that have served such important political and economic platforms for Putin to discuss social and economic policy and put themselves on a grand stage have turned their back against them. And it just shows how powerful they are, really, against regimes that are deemed.
You talked about the isolation of South Africa, and it is true that some South African athletes and sports people were able to compete elsewhere. But in truth, the South Africans did say that the sporting ban, and some of which did apply to individuals in some sports, was one of the most powerful weapons in persuading them, or compelling them, actually, to abandon apartheid. Surely a complete ban on Russian participation in international sport, including the individuals, is part of bringing the Ukrainian people's suffering to an end faster.
And this is where, as I was saying, these sanctions against the teams definitely do work. Against the individuals, it's much less effective. But the teams, that's really very important.
Why do you say it's less effective? Because for Russians, the sort of emotional and political impact of Medvedev being banned, or some one of their boxers, let's say, being banned, is as important as for them as their football team being banned, surely.
Well, I think you've seen, actually, some of the power of the banning of the individual, but these have been cases where individuals have actually worn the Z symbol that is trying to support Russian victory. And you see this across athletics, you see this across swimming, and actually some very severe bans have been implemented, demonstrating that if you do try and use your position to actually promote Putin's position, then you are going to suffer in terms of the sports world. I mean, a 9-month ban on swimming most recently, and also you've also had sanctions on people who attended a Putin rally that was supporting Russian achievements in the Olympics. So I think that you are seeing that, and I think where individuals are saying that actually we don't support the war, we want peace, that's a very different scenario to people who are actively trying to promote Russia's cause.
All right. Well, we've heard from both our guests and we've tested their positions a little bit. We've roasted both of you lightly. But let's begin the search for some common ground. And we'll start by hearing from a Ukrainian tennis star. Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Dr. Mike Duignan, Director of the Observatory for Human Rights and Events at the University of Surrey, and Dr. Rachel Pistol, Historian and Research Fellow at King's College London. We're talking about whether it's right that Russian players should be banned from Wimbledon. And we found out some of what both our guests think and why. Now, if we can, we'd like to find some common ground, or at least a common understanding. But before we do that, let's hear from someone with a very personal stake in this debate, who has her own views on what should happen. Here's the Ukrainian tennis player, Elena Svitolina, winner of 16 Women's Tennis Association Tour titles and the former world number 3. She'll be playing at Wimbledon this summer.
The best way would be not to ban completely, but make them speak about the war in Ukraine, to ask them if they support the invasion in Ukraine, if they support their government, and if they can answer those questions, if they say that they don't support it, they don't support Putin, they don't support Lukashenko, then they would be allowed to participate, and then we would see that they didn't choose this government, that they don't support what's going on, they don't support the war. This would be very clear, and if it could be public, this would make them just be a human, because right now we don't know their opinion. We see that the Russian army has invaded Ukraine, and this is a horrible thing, what is happening to Ukrainian people and what is really, really happening to Ukraine, how many cities are destroying. And yeah, we just want from the tennis players to hear their statement regarding this.
Whatever the actual detail and the facts of what's happening in the ground, to some extent, Mike, Elena Svitolina, I guess, lines up with what Rachel says, that if the individual makes their position clear, they shouldn't, and it's anti the invasion, they shouldn't be punished.
And I think I agree. You know, you've got individual freedom of choice. You know, people have been given an option to choose whether they want one side or the other. If they sign the document, if they come out against the Ukraine war, then they can play. If not, then they're not. I think that there's something kind of broader, which is that there is a way in which Wimbledon could have done this in a slightly different way, perhaps like the Olympics has done it, which is getting them to kind of represent themselves, not under Russia.
They compete under the flag of the, not of the Russian Federation, but the Russian Olympic Committee.
Absolutely,
apparently.
yeah. And that at least separates them enough. And I think that we haven't scrutinised enough what Wimbledon, as event organisers, should have done differently. And I think that, again, that goes back to my point about the fog of war. people will inevitably be doing things differently, and I think that we need to learn from this and think about what our international and event collective response will be.
Do you think that's right, Rachel, that there might be a way through this, which is not about specifically the issue of principle, but the manner in which the principles are applied or have been applied?
Yes, I mean, I do think that it's about the manner that the principles are applied. So as you're saying, it's about having that distance, and I think that is really important. Plus, if you're going to do a ban, you need to either make it a blanket ban or not. If you're only at the moment banning players but not other officials who might work at Wimbledon, like umpires, physiotherapists, other things like that, then actually, I mean, I know they're going for a high-profile ban, but it's the inconsistencies and how that works. I mean, it's certainly been suggested that this has been more pushed onto the Lawn Tennis Association by the government, because they were saying we can't guarantee that visas will be provided for these people because of obviously our stance on the war against Ukraine. So you have to think about how much have they really thought about the practicalities of how this would work, more than is this just a political decision that's been forced onto a sporting body?
Yeah, but let's just step back here a moment here, and I'm sure we could find a sort of softly way through, but let's remember who we're dealing with here. We're dealing with Vladimir Putin, who, let's leave aside what he did in Chechnya, but, for example, invaded Crimea in 2014. Everybody was unhappy, everybody shouted and so on, and then they gave him the World Cup to organise. I mean, surely there is a point at which we have to say, as I think Mike was saying earlier on, whatever the problems for individuals at the edges, we have to take a very hard position if we're going to stop this kind of thing coming from Moscow again and again and again.
Well, yes, and that's why Mike's saying that you have to remove the sporting events. They shouldn't be given to Russia. They shouldn't be in any way supporting Russia. And this is true, but this is what the Lawn Tennis Association are doing is very different to what the whole of the rest of the International Tennis Federation are doing. So they have taken a unilateral decision which does not represent the rest of the sport, which has already cancelled Russia and Belarus's membership to the Tennis Federation, and are doing various other sanctions. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Martina Navratilova, who of course defected to America from behind the Iron Curtain back when it was, has actually spoken out and said that she doesn't think it's fair to ban the individuals so long as they don't support the war and so long as they talk for peace. Because obviously she has some quite incredible insights that come from her experiences of living in a similarly oppressive system.
Yeah, but Mike, OK, let me come to you, Mike, because I get the sense that you're saying, well, maybe we could be a little bit softer on anybody who comes out. So what is to stop somebody from Mr. Putin's inner circle ringing up a top tennis player and saying, you know what, we do want you to play in Wimbledon. We don't mind if you go a bit silent on Ukraine. We'd prefer it if you didn't name Mr. Putin as a terrible dictator or anything. But if you want to say that you're unhappy and that you'd prefer peace and so on, that's fine. Go on, win the tournament, and then we'll sort all of that out afterward. Don't worry, we won't put your mother in the gulag. What is it sensible to, if you like, concede from the hard ban where we started, that maybe we'll be soft on some individuals if they behave properly? Because people behave properly for, today's reasons, and then they change their minds next week.
Yeah, I agree. I think we always pit things as contradictions. It's really annoying. Like, it's either you support the ban or you don't support the ban, and I think that there's always that middle ground whereby the common ground, which is essentially there are informal mechanisms. For example, you listed one of them, whereby there is a way in which to protect people, but also come out as a citizen, but also as a role model, because we haven't discussed the importance of these players as being role models for the next generation, to come out and say things against the war effort, but yet still allow Russia to compete in that. So I think that all those invisible mechanisms that we don't see need to go on behind the scenes, but there needs to be assurance on the individual level that friends, family aren't going to be killed, a sense of the gulags, as you suggest. So.
Well, it's not an either-or situation, is it? Yeah. We're not talking about saying that you can't both support Ukraine and also be anti the ban on individual players in Wimbledon.
Yeah.
We obviously don't have anybody representing the Russian Federation here to explain their position and why, they are in the right here and why they're being persecuted and so on. But we read that they think that some of the things that are being said about what they're doing are not true and so on. But let me just come back to you, Rachel, and ask you if you worry that this idea that really we shouldn't punish the individual essentially allows people essentially to kid us. We know that Mr. Putin and many of his associates have protested innocence. They've never done anything wrong, but actually the truth is they, in practice, as far as we know, may well support this invasion. How do we know, unless somebody specifically does something to put themselves on the side of the Ukrainians, that their silence or their soft words aren't disguising support for this invasion?
And this is where we have to look at actions. How are people acting? How are people acting within the circuits as well? I mean, we've just heard from a Ukrainian tennis player, and there are others who are saying this in terms of let's talk to people, find out what's happening on an individual level rather than just branding them and tarring them with the same brush given their nationality. And so you're looking at actions, and we can see that athletes have many athletes, I'm not talking about tennis players, but outside of that, have been incredibly vocal in their support for Putin. So it seems that most people who want to make it known that they support Putin do not have a problem with that, and are quite happy to accept the sanctions that come with that as well.
All right. Look, this is the part of the show where I try a third way, a Trevor solution on both of you to see. And I should warn you, normally it's completely rejected, but let me try this on you. What if we said that, fine, Russians may play, but as long as this situation in Ukraine goes on, they may not win any prize money. And that prize money will be donated to the cause of Ukrainian refugees.
You see, that is positive. You see, that's more than just a tokenistic thing of saying, well, we might just ban a couple of famous players. If you're actually doing something practical that is going to assist Ukrainians, then I think that is a much more positive approach.
What do you think, Mike? Withhold the prize money?
It's hard to deny. Giving money to Ukraine through that means would be positive. However, I think it misses the point. I think that the point is as Putin rains down rockets on Ukraine, and we can't go in there physically to support the effort, then we have to use social, cultural, political means outside of the geographical borders in order to exert pressure. And so I don't think that achieves that, although it does achieve money going into the Ukrainian refugee crisis, for example, which is important. But I don't think it...
Can I also just say that the Lawn Tennis Association, of course, the fact that they've banned Russians, this is not just Wimbledon, this is all of the grass tournaments in the UK. And whereas Wimbledon's not going to really suffer financially from that, the rest of the British tournaments are potentially... So who is really suffering? How much pressure is banning a few Russians from playing in the Wimbledon tournament and not affiliated, with Russia officially, going to affect? Is that going to hurt Putin more than actually sort of penalising all grass tennis competitions this year is, but maybe that's a price worth paying.
Yeah.
Well, since both of you have now robbed me of my prospects of becoming the mediator in this terrible situation by rejecting my brilliant solution, can I just ask you one last thing, which I think you may both agree about? If this Wimbledon decision stands, others are going to copy it, aren't they?
They will do, and they already have done. We've already discussed different examples of Formula One, Eurovision, FIFA, etc. They've all kind of come behind. They haven't had the same policies in terms of how they've done it or how they've banned. And I think that that's strange because they should be united as an international sports grouping of event owners. But yeah, they're all going to come into alignment. And so they should, because because what's happening at the international level is that these events and festivals and owners are writing into the operational mandates and protocols. Essentially, human rights is fundamental to the delivery of these things. Just look at Qatar 2022 with the migrant worker deaths. I think that sort of thing is becoming very, very prominent.
Yeah, and do you know what? I completely agree with that.
OK, that's the sort of thing the television host never wants to hear, but that's fine on this occasion. Coming up, we've heard from our guests and they've heard from each other. High degree of agreement, but we will ask them whether they see any prospect for common ground on the actual decision. And I'll give my view. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined once again by Dr. Mike Duignan and Dr. Rachel Pistol. We've been talking about whether it's right that Russian players should be banned from Wimbledon. Well, we're coming to the end, so I'm going to give each of you a minute to tell me what you feel you might have learned from our conversation, and if anything you've heard has changed your mind about the other view. Mike first.
I think that, certainly something that Rachel said in terms of the impact on the individual. And I think it's really easy to forget about the individual impact and that there might be a more creative solution to this instead of kind of solving the contradiction between banning or not banning. And I think that it's really important to recognise that there is always a space in between of negotiation. So I think that that's a really key thing. But I think that, as we've seen, there's been a lot of things that we have agreed on as academics, as in the spirit of debate. But, I would still ban because I believe in the political and economic pressure that puts on, and piece by piece, that's really, really important, I think.
Yeah, I agree that there are we do have areas of common ground. I think the significance of what you're saying in terms of how these bans are enforced and the pressure that they do exert on a country are really significant. And I do think that action needs to be taken. I still think that it's really important to think about some of this sort of collateral damage and how that affects people and how this can be managed in sort of a more positive way for sort of innocent casualties. I'm not talking about just anyone, I'm just talking about people who perhaps are very anti-Putin but wish to still play their sports.
Well, both of you have been absolutely preposterously reasonable in this discussion. Mike, you started with the idea that we have to pay attention to the individual. In the end, we're in a situation where the interests of whole populations have to take precedence. And you, Rachel, worried about the impact of decisions which might look like and actually be discriminating. It's very interesting here that, in a peculiar way, Britain, which has historically been more interested in individual freedom, has taken a decision against that, where France, which has always been more interested in exercising the role of the state, has done the opposite. I guess that what worries me most is that we just let things go, and I worry a great deal. That's why I want to say, let's take the money away. But I guess in the end of it, I have to say that probably what bothered me most is the potential for Putin propaganda here. But anyway, thank you for a really stimulating discussion. See you all next week.